City Club is where civic-minded people come together to make Portland and Oregon a better place for everyone to live, work, and play. I'm Greg McPherson, president of City Club. Members and guests are gathered today at the Sentinel Hotel, along with all of you listening on OPB Radio or watching on Portland Community Media. The generous support of City Club's corporate and media partners enables us to put on the state's best civic programs week after week. Our media partner is Oregon Business Magazine. Our current Friday Forum sponsors are Echo Northwest, Chevron, Girding Edlin, Morel Inc., Northwest Natural, and Schwabe Williamson and Wyatt. Please join me in showing our appreciation for all of them. Next week's Friday Forum will feature Professor Roger Porter of Reed College, speaking on whether warnings to students of sexual or other traumatic content should be required in the study of literature. This presentation promises to explore the tensions between freedom of expression and protection of individuals who have suffered harm. You can learn more about City Club events, purchase tickets, and become a member on our website, pdxcityclub.org. As always, we will be live tweeting today's program. You can follow along and join the conversation using the hashtag PDXCityClub. After leading a discussion among our panelists, Jake Weigler will facilitate a Q&A session with those in the live audience. Asking questions at the microphone is a privilege of City Club membership, but anyone in the live audience here at the Sentinel may write a question on one of the index cards found in the center of the tables. Hold the card up and City Club's staff will collect them before or during the Q&A session. If you're not yet a member and decide your question needs to be asked at the microphone to do it justice, go ahead and ask it there, and then sign up for your membership at the end of today's meeting. City Club would like to thank our event partners who helped make today's program possible: Ceasefire Oregon, Gun Owners for Responsible Ownership, Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense in America, Oregon Alliance for Gun Safety, Oregon Public Health Association, and Oregon Public Health Institute. And now for today's program. America continues to experience terrible mass shootings. President Obama's remarks after a recent one at a predominantly black church in Charleston, South Carolina, reflected a sense of the tragedy, but also of the fatigue we collectively feel over something so horrific happening yet again. One response has been to remove the Confederate battle flag from public places. While removal of this symbol is entirely appropriate, one can't help but wonder whether it's happening in part because we seem unable to cope with the larger problem of gun violence and the impact of that violence on minority communities. Today, these issues will be explored by the following panel. Annalisa Davis is the volunteer leader of the Oregon chapter of Moms Demand Action for Gun Sense in America. Representative Lou Frederick is serving in his fourth term as a member of the Oregon House, representing part of North and Northeast Portland. Robert Ewell is a retired Marine who helped found Gun Owners for Responsible Ownership after his wife Cindy was killed by a shooter at Clackamas Town Center in 2012. Our moderator is Jake Weigler, consultant to the Oregon Alliance for Gun Safety. Please join me in welcoming our guests to Friday Forum.
Thank you, President McPherson. Again, my name is Jake Weigler. I'm a campaign consultant to the Oregon Alliance for Gun Safety. And personally, I came to this issue after the tragedies at Sandy Hook and Clackamas Town Center and felt I need to get more involved. And through the Alliance, we've now been able to engage over 50 organizations across the state working on state and local policies to reduce gun violence, touching on a whole variety of sectors and constituencies of folks. So I thought we'd get a start today by just briefly talking to each of our panel members about kind of what brings them to this conversation and what really motivates them in this conversation. Representative Frederick, do you want us to go ahead and start?
Sure. Thank you. And thank you all for being here. I have a number of paths to this particular conversation, but I will tell you that there's one image that sticks with me. At one time, I was the Director of Public Information for the Portland schools, and I got a phone call in the middle of the day from a very upset, teary Norma Paulus, who, if you remember, was the superintendent of public instruction at the time. And she said, "I need you to come to Springfield." And I said, well, for what? And she told me why, and it was the shooting that had taken place down there. And she asked a number of public information people to head for Springfield. And so I went to my superintendent and said, I'm going to Springfield, and she asked me why, and I told her, and she said, get out of here. And I headed on south to Springfield. When I got down there, there were 40 satellite trucks arriving at the high school out in front. One of the satellite trucks was a satellite truck from Japan, or at least they were using satellite truck there. A Japanese reporter, the first thing he asked me, because he wanted to talk with someone about what was going on, his first question to me was, how many guns are American kids allowed to bring to school? That hurt. It made it very clear to me what the rest of the world was seeing about how we handled gun violence and guns in this country. And I began to think a lot more about that, and frankly began to understand that what we're dealing with in many cases is a marketing plan. It has nothing to do with safety. It has primarily to do with selling as many guns as possible. And I have seen that be very clear, not just in terms of the number of, and somebody, I think you were telling me, the number of ads for guns in certain magazines, but also with the basic concept of fear. We have seen an increase in the approach to make sure people are as fearful as possible of each other, and that helps sell as many guns as possible. And how do we see that? Well, we see it in my former profession. Good luck going through the first 5 minutes of any newscast without seeing something taking place in terms of guns. And then we also see it in just general entertainment. There are, at any given time, at least probably 6 or 7 Law and Order, NCSI, all of the different various entertainment shows that usually involve the death of a young woman and then trying to find out how that person died, and some kind of system of catching that person, often using guns. This is a marketing plan of fear, and I think it's time to call it for what it is, because we need to start really addressing those particular issues, and that's what I hope we're going to be able to do.
Thank you. Annalise Davis with Moms Demand Action. Do you want to go next?
So I am a full-time volunteer and stay-at-home mom with Moms Demand Action. When the Sandy Hook shooting happened, my daughter was 18 months old, and I lived in Texas. This, for me, was the first time that I could even begin to fathom what those parents were feeling as they rushed to the school to find their children, as they waited to see if their children were going to be the ones who walked through the door or not. I remember standing over my daughter's crib that night and just crying and crying and crying and thinking, all of these things that I'm doing to keep her safe, the child safety seats, the safety locks on the cabinets, the baby gates, what does all of this mean if we live in a country where first graders are gunned down while they huddle in the corner of their school? And that's when I decided to get involved on this issue. And what I learned when I came to this issue, first of all, I've had the opportunity to meet so many people whose lives have been touched by gun violence beyond the shootings that make the media. Because as Representative Frederick said, you can pick up the paper every single day and see something there, but there's also a lot that doesn't even make it into the paper because this has become so commonplace. There are families every day who are devastated by gun violence. I learned that I had really sort of unconsciously absorbed a lot of myths about gun violence in our country, myths that this is just the way that things should be, that the gun lobby is way too strong to ever take on and fight, that if a criminal wants to get a gun, the criminal will always get a gun. This was just not an issue that I knew very much about. And as I learned more about it, I learned that there are common sense policies, there are common sense steps that we can take that we can all agree on that will reduce gun violence. And when I moved to Oregon, this really became my full-time job aside from my 4-year-old. And it's been exciting to travel around the state to meet so many other ordinary citizens who are getting involved on this issue and are making a difference. Because I believe with all of my heart that we do not have to live with this in this country. We do not have to live this way. There are steps we can take. There are things we are doing here in Oregon and across the country. And I'm looking forward to a discussion about some of those today. Thank you.
Thanks. And last, let's introduce Robert Ewell, who's with Gun Owners for Responsible Ownership. Robert, thanks for being here.
Thank you, Jake. My name is Robert Ewell. I'd like to clarify one thing. Mr. McPherson introduced me as a retired Marine. I was a Marine, and I am retired. I am not a retired Marine. I'm just average Joe. Until December 11th, 2012, I was just another person that would read the paper and wonder why, why these mass shootings were occurring. Why was there so much gun violence going on? I never believed it would happen to me, but my wife was murdered at Clackamas Town Center when she was Christmas shopping, just out of the blue. She was murdered by a young individual who apparently felt very disenfranchised, wanted to kill himself, commit suicide. And sadly, his anger was so intense that he felt he needed to share that anger with as many people as he possibly could. Thankfully, at Clackamas Town Center, although several people were killed, my wife, Steve Forsythe, and another young lady was injured. The individual with the gun did not have the expertise to be able to succeed in killing as many people as he had planned on doing. Sadly, that's not the case in every situation, as we all know very well. Until that time, I would sit back and read the paper and say, what's going on with these people? And surely somebody will do something about it. And it wasn't until after I became personally involved that I realized that, I have a voice, other people have a voice out there too, and we need to be more proactive and explaining what responsible gun ownership means. I grew up with guns. My family lived in the Horseheaven Hills in eastern Washington. Grew up hunting game birds since I was able to stand up to a shotgun. Certainly learned at a young age to be responsible with a gun. My experience in the military taught me the lethality of a weapon. How when you pull a trigger, it doesn't just stop in front of you, it goes for miles after that. In the paper we read today that kids are going down the street just shooting the guns willy-nilly. They have no idea where that bullet goes. Only when you read in the paper the next day that somebody a block away had their windshield shot out in their car or a bullet went next to a child's crib. Shortly after Clackamas Town Center, we met Jake and Paul Kemp, the brother-in-law of Steve Forsythe, who was shot at Clackamas Town Center as well. Other people, Tom O'Connor's here, a board member for GoPro. We got together and decided that the issue was being battled by two very polarized sides, and that nobody was able to bring the issue into context. We formed and we decided that we would try to be a mediating force between the two opposing opinions and try and show that there are gun owners out there that are responsible, that want to be sure that guns are handled in a safe manner, that do not want any of our rights taken away from us, and that certainly the fight for the Second Amendment is not a fight to be fought. We should be fighting to make our streets safer. And I really enjoy the opportunity to be here and speak with you folks. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So for today's conversation, I thought I would start by focusing on this is a very emotionally intense issue with strong felt feelings on both sides. And frequently in the gun violence prevention movement, those strong feelings come with a feeling of despair. We've seen in the last few weeks 2 very highly publicized national shootings, and a lot of that national conversation has been, why does this continue to happen? Why can't we do anything about it? And I think the interesting thing is that there is something we can do about it. And from my conversations with folks across the country where they've literally said, all eyes are on Oregon right now, there's been a lot of focus on the work that happened during the legislative session here to really enact some stronger gun laws and work to take on this issue. So I thought I would kind of start with the conversation there because it is a difficult issue, but I think it's important for us to recognize the work that we've done and that things are starting to change in this state. So I'd be interested in kind of getting your initial thoughts on kind of what we've done this year at the state level, and then also kind of where we can go from here in that conversation.
Well, first of all, it's incremental. That's one thing we should make it very clear. We managed to pass 2 significant bills related to guns, the background checks and also the domestic violence bills. Those are 2 bills that had an impact, and I'm very pleased to see that. The next steps are frankly unclear right now. We had a bill that we thought was going to pass that was going to allow folks to transfer within families, et cetera. Because what we have, and I have to sort of make this very clear, what we have is are 2 or 3 cultures, 2 cultures. One is a group of folks who grew up with guns. I did. And I was a pretty good marksman at one time. But there are groups of people who grew up with guns and still use them, who are still hunting. And they pass along those hunting rifles to their families, to their relatives, on and on and on. But because you pass along those hunting rifles, you don't have a large market going on. And so that's one group of people who are generally in the rural areas. On my street, we used to have 5 different families that would go hunting every year and get elk and bring it back to their freezers. We have no one who goes hunting on my street now. I live in Irvington, and that has changed significantly. But there is a real difference when somebody is walking down the street outside a school in Burns with a rifle, and somebody is walking down the street in my neighborhood with a rifle. In Burns, they're hunting. They know they're going to go hunting for duck or antelope or deer. In my neighborhood, you're wondering who they're hunting. And that's a real difference. And understanding that difference across the state is a difficult one because there are folks who have bought into the idea that any restriction at all is a slippery slope to take away your guns. That's nonsense, but they still have bought into it because it's been very well sold. And it's time for us to really begin to address some of the things that we can do to regulate. Yes, regulate the kinds of guns and the amount of guns, and then also have the information. What I'd like to see is us really do something regarding getting the direct information about the impact of guns on our community. I'm particularly interested in suicide issues and how many suicides are part of the gun culture that we're dealing with. And I would like to see us do some things on that. So that's what I'm looking forward to in terms of the next session, the next few bills that people will begin to bring forward.
I think when we look at gun violence in Oregon, one figure that was very shocking to me is that more Oregonians die from gun violence than die in car accidents. There's not one thing that we can do that's going to stop all of those deaths. Just like putting safety belts in the car didn't stop all traffic accidents. There are incremental steps that we can take. I think we took 2 very strong steps in this last legislative session. Really, one of the steps we took on background checks probably the single most effective thing we could do to reduce gun violence in Oregon. I did a lot of talking around the state on background checks, and frankly, most Oregonians did not realize that while you had to have a background check if you bought a gun at a gun dealer, you had to have a background check if you bought a gun at a gun show, you could go online and find someone willing to meet you that evening in a parking lot and pop open their trunk, and you could buy a gun from that person with no questions asked. Closing the background check loophole was a really important piece of legislation. I think it really brought our laws up to date with technology and the changes in how we do business. States that have closed their background check loophole have tremendously positive outcomes in all areas of gun violence prevention. There are 48% fewer law enforcement killed in the line of duty. There are 48% fewer suicides by gun. It also reduces the number of women who are killed by their partners in domestic violence situations by 46%. Those are some really big numbers, and those are people who are going to be with us in our communities. They're our neighbors, our friends, our family members who might not be there otherwise if we'd not been able to get the law passed. And a lot of that work was done by people, ordinary people who were speaking up around this issue. We had moms and our alliance partners all over the state making phone calls, educating people, turning out postcards and emails, and it made a difference because I think for the first time, our legislators really started to hear from the vast majority of Oregonians who want to see common sense regulations and laws passed that keep us all safer.
Well, I tell you, the struggle to get the backgrounds checked through the legislature was very much an eye-opener for me. I had to go do a crash course in my civics lessons again. And GoFro, Gun Owners for Responsible Ownership, and I'll refer to as GoFro from here on out, we do not necessarily lobby so much as we try to present a reasonable approach through education and understanding of the proper use and handling of guns. It did take us 3 years to get this law through, and primarily because, as the representative said, that there is such a pushback from the gun lobby that they would just not listen to reason, and they propagandized basically everything that went on. I thought that was very unfair. Thankfully, as Annalise said, the majority of Oregonians do realize that they want a safe society and that our rights, constitutional rights, are intact. They are not an easy thing to lose, but that certain measures need to be taken to ensure that guns are properly handled. And one of those measures was to make sure that people that were not safe around guns should not have as easy access to them as they have had. The gun issue, the gun safety issue, is so multifaceted that there is not one single thing that you're going to do that's going to immediately stop all gun violence. As Annalise said, we have seat belts, we have all kinds of safety equipment in our cars, and yet still people die in car accidents. So we're going to continue in the future. People are still going to hear about gun legislation and gun safety rules and stuff to help make society safer. This is not a one-issue thing. Now that we had background checks passed doesn't mean it's all going to go away. It just means that the issue is forefront. People realize that there is a gun safety issue out there, and it needs to be dealt with before more innocent people lose their lives.
Thank you. So I want to try and tease out something I think I heard in the conversation kind of emerging here, which is the idea of culture, and maybe that there are different gun cultures that exist within a community, within a state. And one kind of point of tension I think you hear in this conversation is there's one school of thought that says the gun is the problem, and that by putting it in the hands of someone who's dangerous, you greatly increase their ability to be a danger to themselves and others. And so it's about making sure they don't have access to that weapon. And there's another school of thought that says, no, this is more about the individual and how they are viewing a gun and their use of a gun and their overall mental health and other things like that. And so I think the answer is both, but I always wanted to kind of get your thoughts on that, because that's a big conversation that comes up. Is this about limiting access to weapons, or is this about helping people who have dangerous decision-making processes?
Well, I think when you look at at gun deaths in the U.S., they're 20 times higher than any other developed country. And that's not because we have more criminals. It's not because people are more mentally ill in the U.S. than elsewhere. It's not because domestic violence is a greater problem here than elsewhere. It really does. It's a unique American problem because it comes down to easy access to guns by dangerous people. It is, I think, a both-and question. I think it's really important to start looking at gun violence as a public health issue, and it's not something where everything can be solved through legislation. It also has to do with education, with changing our culture around guns, with safe storage, with helping people who own guns understand their responsibilities and what they can do to prevent gun violence simply by keeping their weapons locked up. By storing them safely, by not leaving them lying around where someone can pick them up and who shouldn't have them and take them out and do damage. So I do think it is a both-and question.
So, Jake, I'd like to say something. So the question was, is it the gun or is it the person? Certainly, it can be both. Guns do empower people. That's why we see a lot of these youngsters carrying them around. You have a very young, impulsive individual, teenager with a gun, he feels very much empowered. And the guns that we have now are not really the guns that we grew up with, or that I grew up with. I grew up with guns that you used that were a tool to go hunt with. Nowadays we have weapons, and then we have guns. So weapons are guns that were designed specifically to use as a weapon against a man, as the way I see it, as they're militarized guns. I don't believe that they really have a lot of function. You certainly can't use them to go out hunting with. So is it the person or is it the gun? So certainly the gun does empower the person. The type of gun will empower the person even more. If you have a gun with a large magazine, certainly you can feel more empowered. But the deal is we need to get these guns, as Annalise said, and hold people accountable for their own weapons. So if I own a gun, then I feel like I should be accountable for that gun. I want to keep it locked up. I want to make sure it doesn't get stolen and taken out and used illegally. And not to mention the fact that it's a valuable piece of equipment that I have or possession that I have. So I certainly want to keep it locked up and put away. The individual that murdered my wife was able to walk into his friend's apartment, who apparently was asleep on the couch, walked in, got his automatic rifle out of his closet, and simply walked out with it. Just that easy. When the police went in discuss or speak with the individual that owned the gun, they walked into his apartment, and I was told that he had several guns laying around his apartment, totally unsecured. He had one on a coffee table, he had one on his dresser, and he had one on a fireplace mantle. What's the purpose? What's the purpose? A responsible gun owner does not leave his guns out laying around like that. We need to make sure we get the cavalier attitude about having guns needs to change. It didn't used to be that way. And I think we need to get back and educate people as exactly what they have access to.
Well, a couple of things come to mind for that particular question. You know, Oregon was known for regulating the amount, the sale of Sudafed, because it was clearly being used by to create meth by meth addicts. And so we began to regulate that. And that gives me at least a little bit of a model. It also, I brought this along because it always strikes me, some of the language here. Let me read this to you. Nothing, in our opinion, should be taken to cast doubt on the long-standing prohibitions on the possession of firearms by felons and the mentally ill, or laws forbidding the carrying of firearms in sensitive places such as schools and government buildings, or laws imposing conditions and qualifications on the commercial sale of arms. We also recognize another important limitation on the right to keep and bear arms. As Miller said, we have explained that the sorts of weapons protected were those in common use at the time. We think that limitation is fairly supported by the historical tradition of prohibiting the carrying of dangerous and unusual weapons. It is very unusual for me to quote Antonin Scalia, but that's who I was quoting. So for me, it is a matter of how do we in fact regulate this? What do we do to make sure that those arms are not showing up, are not so easily available to young people who are struggling with, who are always going to be struggling because of their age developmentally. We need to be able to find a way to both deal with the individual and the sheer numbers of guns that are out there.
I couldn't agree more. So I want to touch on another topic that we've kind of alluded to a couple times already, and be conscientious of. This is a conversation at the City Club of Portland that's happening in downtown Portland, but is also being heard in Prineville and Enterprise and the rest of the state. And so in this conversation, sometimes we hear that there's a fundamental rural-urban divide. I think we hear that a lot in Oregon. Sometimes I think it's a way for us to avoid having a conversation with each other. But I'm interested in kind of your thoughts about that and how real of an issue that is, and how much that needs to be part of the conversation.
Well, I'll pick up that one. Up until just recently, the last 10 years, I have always lived in the country, and I've always had a gun with me. I actually did a fair amount of hunting, and when in my younger years, I was collected food stamps, so I'd take my gun out and I'd go out and get some meat. And I lived on the east side of the mountains. I lived in a very rural part of northeastern Washington, 3/4 of a mile south of the Canadian border, a little town called Republic. And that was real cowboy land. And much like Eastern Oregon is, real cowboy land. It's a culture out there. So when Lou mentioned that the appropriateness of people walking down the street with a gun, certainly it's not appropriate for somebody to walk down the street in downtown Portland or Salem or any of the larger cities. But on the east side of the mountains, it's not unusual for somebody to come in off of working in the backcountry and have a holster. Responsible gun owner leaves the gun in the truck. He might not have to take his holster off, but he doesn't want to walk down the street with a gun unless he's trying to make a message to somebody that he doesn't like. But so it's a different culture, totally different culture. I mean, you actually live with a tool, a gun, that you have to have with you, basically. When I worked in eastern Washington on the ranch, we had cougar and bear and coyotes and stuff that we would encounter. Didn't have to shoot them, but we would encounter them, and it was nice to have a rifle with you. I know my neighbor always, when he would go out and check his cows, we'd have to go up to the Canadian side and bring our cows back down. He always carried a sidearm with him just for that very reason. He never carried it into town. It's just not something, it's not a prudent thing to do. Could have, because that's the right to do. You have the right to do that, but it's not the prudent thing to do. And I think what we need to get a grasp on is what is a responsible gun owner do what's prudent and what's not prudent.
I don't think there should be an urban-rural divide on the issue of responsibility. If you choose to own a gun, whether you're living in urban Portland or you're out in a rural area, it's your responsibility to keep that gun out of the hands of people who might injure themselves with it. I think this opens up the discussion around child deaths, unintentional child shootings, which again are a rural and urban problem. That's not something that is unique to one area and doesn't exist in another. I am from Texas, probably many, if not most, of my family members are gun owners. We have deep roots in the country there, and I have family members who make their living as hunting and fishing guides. This is their living relies on them having guns. But they're responsible with them. And I think there's a lot of education that we can do throughout the state on what does it mean to be safe with your guns. Children will get into anything, and it doesn't matter if you're a kid in the country or a kid in the city. I have a personal story about this. I took my daughter to visit my parents last summer, and I asked my dad where he was keeping the sawed-off shotgun these days, and he said, well, I'm keeping it on top of the armoire. And I said, is it loaded? And he said, well, it doesn't do me any good if it's not loaded. And my brother's kids are over there all the time. I said, I really want you to take that down while we're here, and unload it, lock it away. He said, oh, the kids are never going to find it. I said, well, my brother and I, when we were young, we used to go into your closet and get your gun out. And he turned completely ashen. All of the color drained from his face. He had absolutely no idea. And we had been taught from the time we were very, very small that you did not touch a gun, that was not a toy, it was something you took very seriously, you did not play with it. My father had lost friends as a child through accidental shootings. So he was very serious about this when we were growing up, but we were kids. The responsibility should not be on children to keep themselves safe from weapons that are unsecured. The responsibility is on adults, and that doesn't matter where in Oregon you live. If you are choosing to have a gun in your home, and it's absolutely your right to choose that, you also need to take responsibility for keeping that weapon secured and safe.
I will be short because I know you need to get to questions, but what I continue to see is, unfortunately, still see the rural-urban divide, even more so. Governor McCall once said that the fact was that he was not seeing as many people who lived in Portland who had relatives in the rest of the state. And as a result of that, you also don't see that respect for the work that's done in the rest of the state or the understanding of the cultures that exist. And that goes both ways. The folks who are regularly hunting cannot understand why anyone would be upset, and that that people in the urban communities would understand what was taking place regarding guns. Those who come from the rural communities and come into the city of Portland are often, because I've talked with them, often packing because they believe that there's a gun shootout every day in the city of Portland. Why? Because the only media that they have any contact with spends a great deal of time saying just that. And as a result, they believe that they have to protect themselves because everything's going to be going to hell, basically, as soon as they as soon as they cross the line into the city of Portland. This is a struggle that we have because we no longer have a common media that really gives us a sense of what is regularly going on in our communities. And what is regularly going on in our communities is not a regular gun shooting going on, or Uzis in the high schools, or whatever. We actually have regular people just sort of walking down the street with no problems. Many people do not know that, and there's a real disconnect, and I think part of our issue is going to have to be reconnecting the state, something we haven't done yet.
Thanks. And there's only a few minutes left before we're going to take questions from the audience. So I thought as the last question I'd kind of throw out to you all, we've touched on policy and laws and the media, but for folks here today or listening in, what are some things they can do kind of in their day-to-day life to affect this conversation? Because it's not just a conversation that needs to happen in the Capitol, but in our daily lives. So I wanted to see if you all had any quick thoughts on that before we throw it out to the audience.
Well, one thing that people can do is just to have the conversation, as Annalise I can feel her trying to say, whenever you have your children go to another person's house, ask if they have a gun, make sure the gun is secure. Because once again, there's a cavalier attitude towards guns where, oh, nothing will happen, my gun is put away, of course it's loaded, but you need to have that conversation with people so that when your kids do go and visit other houses, that you know that their gun is going to be secure. A lot of people don't really think about it so much. I was talking to an individual the other day, and he said, well, yeah, I've got a pistol, but gosh, I don't know where it's at. But he said, but my wife does. And I go, well, I really think you got to find out where your wife's got that gun, just in case. But that's the kind of conversations you really need to have. You need to really get it out there, and people need to talk about it. And it's, I would like to see or hear people speak about gun safety more frequently than what's been spoken.
I think also recognizing that this is an issue where our voices are needed. I was very active on a lot of issues that had nothing to do with guns before I came to this. This is, City Club of Portland is a group of people who are very active, people who listen to this program on the radio or watch this program, are people who are interested in civic change and in making Oregon a better place. We make a lot of assumptions that our voices aren't needed here, or that they don't matter because somehow the gun lobby is going to overpower whatever it is that we say. I did a lot of phone banking during the background check bill, and I talked to a lovely woman in a more rural district whose legislator was on the fence about voting for background checks. And I asked her if she talked to her legislator, and she said, oh no, but I know he's on our side. And I've known him since he was a little boy, and he's just wonderful, and I haven't called him about this issue because I know he's going to vote for us. And I said, well, actually, he hasn't determined how he's going to vote on this. And she got very quiet, and she said, well, I'll call him at home right now. And that is exactly what we need. We are very fortunate here in Portland to have some very progressive legislators. There are legislators around the state who feel very passionately about getting more gun safety laws passed, or really addressing this issue and having the conversation about what we can do. They tend not to hear from the vast majority of people who would like to see something happen. They tend to hear a great deal from the very small, vocal, extremist minority who don't want any changes. If anything, they want laws lessened and less regulation. So I would encourage everyone who is listening, who is here today, the next time there is an issue coming up in the legislature, the next time there is an issue in your county, in your community, your voice really does need to be heard. So please get involved and speak up.
Well, the good news is, I'll start with the bad news. The bad news is that the folks who were fighting the background checks bill and several other and the domestic violence bill are very adept in many cases in the lobbying effort. They know how to call, who to call, what kinds of emails to send out, and in some numbers. The good news is most folks have figured that out, that's what they're doing. If you call my office and you say you're from a particular, you're one of my constituents, and we ask you where do you live, or if you have a 541 number, it's very likely you're not one of my constituents. But if you call my office and you say that you're one of my constituents and you actually live in Medford, well, then you're not one of my constituents. And we will hear that constantly. We had several thousand emails, but they were almost always from folks outside of my district. And we had only a few emails from inside my district. So part of what's going on and part of what needs to happen is for you to call. Let people truly know, because they believe that they're hearing from the vast majority of people. If they hear a lot of noise, they may not have a lot of substance behind it. They may, in fact, not be constituents. They may be from out of state. We had a couple people calling from out of state. It was very obvious that they were from out of state. But they said, well, I live in the Portland area. Well, where do you live? Well, they would pick someplace like Springfield, and you'd sort of go, aha. This is the kind of thing. This is not a Simpsons episode. So it's a matter of really trying to figure out how we know who's actually doing the lobbying, what they're really saying. This is that's the good news that we've figured that out at this point.
Jake, I'd like to say one thing and reiterate what Lou was saying, and that is, of course, I'm very new to this whole process, and the single most important thing that I have learned in this process in going around and speaking to the different representatives and senators is that they actually do listen when people call and talk to them. They listen. Your voice does count. I never believed it before, but they actually listen. And you don't want to be the person that sits back and says, oh, well, somebody else will take care of that. Because certainly before 2012, that's what I did. Cindy and I both sat back and said, well, how can this happen? Well, somebody else will deal with it. Don't make that mistake. Speak up. It's a simple call. You might talk to a staffer, but the staffer is still going to let the person that you want your call to go to, he's going to let them know that you called and how you feel about the situation. Thank you.
Great. Well, we're now going to open it up to Q&A portion of the program. If you have a written question on an index card, please hold it up high so a City Club staff can come collect it from you. We'll also take questions from the audience. As always, we invite members to the microphone over there to ask their questions. Asking questions at the Friday Forum microphone is a benefit of City Club membership, and membership is open to everyone. Before asking your question, please identify yourself as a City Club member and ask your question in 30 seconds or less. Also, I'll read at least one question from an index card. Go ahead.
My name is Edward Hershey. I'm a City Club member. I have a two-part question. In 2013, in a statewide poll, 4 in 5 Oregonians said they were for background checks, but barely a third of people in this state said they were for regulating semi-automatic weapons and the size of clips that go into them. That was lower than the national average. So the first question I have is, how do you change the hearts and minds, and how do you get that number up at least to 50% or more? And the second question I have is, most law enforcement people I've talked to over the years are strong advocates for more gun control. How do you possibly ally with law enforcement, which has a great respect in some of those rural areas you've talked about, to try to convince more people that gun control is in everybody's interest?
So if I can recap, the question is, why is there not a strong support for an assault weapons or semi-automatic weapons ban and a high-capacity magazine ban? And what can we do to bring law enforcement more into this conversation as advocates? And I'll just give a quick answer and then turn it over to the panel for a little more. The idea that everyone should have to undergo a background check to make sure they can legally own a gun before they buy that gun is a fairly intuitive concept for most folks. And I think conversations about prohibiting certain types of weapons or certain capacity of ammo is not a conversation that's been as well developed. We know that there was the assault weapons ban passed federally in 1994 that then expired and has not been renewed in over a decade. So I think there's more of a conversation to be had there. I hear this great analogy that I think we limit you to 2 or 3 shots in your weapon if you're hunting pheasants, but you don't have any limits if it comes to humans, and that doesn't make a lot of sense. But that's a longer conversation to be had. I don't know if folks have much to add.
I think we're very fortunate in Oregon to have many different organizations who work on this issue, because that's what it's going to take to make the kind of change we need to make. So I would say we have the benefit of the Oregon Alliance, which is an umbrella organization that brings all of the different groups working on this issue around the table, including faith groups, including people who are reaching out to law enforcement, including gun owners. There is a place for anybody who is interested in this issue from a particular angle to get involved and help move that conversation forward. I am always excited to sit down with anybody who wants to come to the table and really talk about what we can do to solve problems of gun violence in our state and our country. So I think there are a lot of different groups working on this. I think those conversations are continuing, and what makes the difference is getting involved and finding the right fit for you, where you can reach out to the people who you think most need to hear this message.
Let's go ahead and take another question.
Muriel Lezak, City Club member, and I too am surprised to find myself agreeing with Justice Scalia, and that's what my question is all about. I think that we would be in much better situation if we were able to limit our guns, that is the guns that we can just own freely, to what the guns were in, 1779 or something, when the Constitution was written. I may be off a year or two. The Founding Fathers certainly didn't anticipate these multi-automatic kinds of guns. Why hasn't anybody, or could somebody, I'm not a lawyer, could somebody bring a case saying, this is what the Constitution says, we will interpret it in terms of the times in which it was written, and any other guns become a privilege since they're dangerous like cars and would require licensing, etc.
You are trying to be too logical here, Muriel. And that is a struggle. That is something a number of people have tried to bring up, as well as the well-regulated militia as part of that phrase it's often forgotten as part of the whole system there. These are the issues that people would like to deal with, but it's been hijacked by an effort to get as many guns as possible into the community, where you have people believing that that is the only way that they can be safe. And so they've got that message. We've got to break that message. And I don't know exactly how we do that. I wish I did. But I think that we've got to begin a process of really speaking to that as much as possible. Because, we have all these folks who proclaim themselves as constitutional scholars who obviously have not read the Constitution. So it's really a struggle for me at times to hear them come forward and say that this is what they want to do. So it's a struggle there. If Scalia is saying this and they're still disagreeing with it or not understanding it, I don't know where they are. And I'm not sure what more can be said, except that we end up with enough people, frankly, who are in elected office who are willing to take on this issue and say enough is enough.
I'd like to say something. I don't think that we're ever going to be able to change the Constitution as it's written. I think it's a no-win battle. What we really need to do is to make the guns that are out there safer and make certain that people that own the guns are held accountable and liable for those guns. Just like we have liability insurance for our cars, we have liability insurance for our property if people get hurt on our property. We need to hold gun owners accountable and liable for their weapons. but pursuing an amendment to the Constitution or to restrict gun ownership is, I don't think it's practical. I don't think it's a winnable approach to gun safety.
Okay, I'm going to take a question from the audience now, which is, can anyone summarize the outcome of any federal gun legislation proposed and how this meshes with state laws? It's kind of the interplay between some of the federal proposals and what's happening at the state level.
I think where we will see movement is at the state level. I think this Congress is not able to vote on whether or not the sky is blue without it ending up in court, honestly. We have some federal representatives from Oregon who are outspoken and fabulous supporters on this issue. I know Representative Blumenauer has a particular personal passion and connection for this. I think we have to look to the communities and the states to make change, and federal change will follow from that. And that's what we're beginning to see around the country. Here in Oregon and elsewhere, we're seeing more and more people stepping up, better and better laws getting passed, and then eventually that will make its way to Washington.
Wish I could disagree with her on that, but the fact is, I think you're absolutely correct. I don't think we can look to the feds to Congress for anything. They are hopelessly deadlocked on who's going to be in power at that particular time and not on issues. And so I don't think we're going to see much of a change at that level. Sorry, that's despairing, but that's how I see it.
I believe we have time for one more question, two more questions, even better. So let's go back to the microphone.
All right, perfect. Walter Robinson II, City Club member. Kind of the perfect segue into my question, because Congress is still polarized and partisan as usual. So my question is, can you hear me now? Okay, there we go. I guess my question is, why is this still a partisan issue? Because no Republicans in the Oregon legislature voted for the background check bill in the Senate.
Why is it? I'm not going to speak for the Senate, first of all. Okay. Understand, I'm going to stay as far away from that as possible, trying to speak for the Senate. It is a partisan issue because it can be an issue that can split, that you can create a partisan issue out of it. That's all. If you talk with folks, they will agree with you on background checks, but they don't feel as though their constituents will, or that they can run on that. Recognize that we have a legislature that is we're going to be running for election, and we have a primary little less than a year from now. It's 9 months, 9 months from now. So we have that's going to be taking place, and there are folks who are willing to run against other folks. We just had 3 recall elections called off, but it still took some significant energy to deal with that, and people were concerned, and they were recalls against Democrats. In many cases, the Republicans have had other folks in primary run in the primary against incumbents on issues like this, and so that's why it's a partisan issue. They understand that that's the dynamic of how you deal with politics.
I just wanted to add one piece to that, which is I think it's important for us to remember that the domestic violence legislation this session did pass with strong bipartisan support. And part of the factor, yeah, it's pretty exciting. And part of the factor there was that the NRA indicated they wouldn't oppose the legislation, so there wasn't kind of this threat that there might be a large amount of national resources that would punish Republicans for supporting that. And that's a trend we've seen throughout the country. We've had bastions of leftist activism like Bobby Jindal and Scott Walker and Mitch Daniels in Indiana signing similar bills into law in their states because it's seen as not having the partisan dynamic and a recognition even among some skeptics of other areas of gun regulation that this is common sense. And so I think there is an ability to get over that partisan divide, but it's certainly a significant one. Last question?
Hi, Carol Collymore, City Club member. I wonder if some of you would address this idea that there are two sort of stereotypical groups of gun owners, white people who are hunters and protectors, and people of color who are criminals. And does that have anything to do with the progress with a white power base not speaking out for gun control or passing any legislation?
Carol, I should have known you were going to come up with a line like that. Thank you very much. Yes, it does. You know, there are several good friends of mine who are the Black African American Hunters Association, and when they have shown up in certain events, that has surprised folks to see that there were hunters, that there were black hunters out there. Donnie Adair has a television show based around hunting, which is pretty cool. But yes, I think that plays into the issue. It's not the total picture, but it certainly plays into the issue, and it's encouraged because it's an easy meme to use to again separate people. Divide and conquer. It's been working for a long time. This just continues that.
So I'd like to point out one thing is that in the last recent gun shootings, the shooter's been a white man. Both the high schools where the shooter was a white man. The person that shot my wife was a white man. All the way back to Thurston, he was a white boy. Yeah, just wanted to point that out, so it's not actually based on race.
We've run out of broadcast time for further questions, so we'll have to stop for the day. This is Greg McPherson, President of City Club, wishing you an enjoyable summer weekend. Please join me in thanking our panelists. We are adjourned.